Greetings. In this video, I'd like to discuss Deuteronomy 28:68, specifically the controversy over whether the portion about selling people should be rendered "you will be sold" in the passive or "you will sell yourselves" in the reflexive. On your screen, you see a comparison of the King James Version and the fairly sober English Standard Version. Now, I could replace the ESV reading with that of the NIV or the NASB or the NRSV or a number of other recent translations, and the result would basically be the same. There are some who have a deep emotional investment in the KJV reading, in the King James reading, and thus who will conclude that these later translations are part of some sort of modern conspiracy to hide a prophetic truth which is revealed in the KJV reading. At the center of these differing translations is the verb hitmakhartem, or hitmakhartem with the conjunction at the beginning. The last two characters, the tau mem, pronounced tem, signifies that this verb, which is in the perfect tense, is in the second person plural. That suffix parallels the structure of Hebrew second person masculine plural pronoun. As for the prefix at the beginning of the word, that is the conjunction, and it's known in this case as a wa conversive, which allows one to interpret a perfect tense verb along the lines of a future tense statement. And I'll return to the wa conversive briefly later in this video. At the center of what you're looking at is the verb hitmakher, which I'd like to discuss now. Suppose we have some verbal root, and here for our model, we'll use the verb pa'al. We'll say that this verb means to do something, to perform some action. Now, Hebrew has multiple verb stems, and one of those stems is known as the hitpa'el stem. Now, a verb in the hitpa'el stem can be read in two ways. It can be read in a passive sense, and it can be read in a reflexive sense. The passive sense of the verb would mean that the verb is done to him. The verb is performed on our subject, while the reflexive sense of the verb would mean he does it to himself, or our subject performs the action upon himself. Now, the mem kaf resh root gives rise to the verbal root makar, which gives rise to verbs meaning to sell. That root in the hitpa'el stem gives us the verb hitmaker, which again can be interpreted passively or reflexively. The passive sense of the verb hitmaker would be he was sold, while the reflexive sense of the verb hitmaker would be he sold himself. Now, I want to note that while verbs in the hitpa'el stem can be read passively, the more literal approach to such structures is to read them reflexively, as the proper passive would be in the nif'al stem, which for the makar root would give rise to the verb nimkar, which will come up later in this video. Now, over the last 15 years, I've tried to explain these basic structural points to certain King James onlyists who had an emotional investment in the KJV reading, and some of them responded by insinuating that this is some sort of bogus rule that was just concocted and cooked up after the time of the King James Bible, so as to have some sort of a counterweight against the KJV reading. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to a translation which predates the KJV. On your screen is a page from the 1560 Geneva Bible. So this translation predates the KJV by a half a century. And what appears on this page is the end of Deuteronomy 28. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page where you see, ye shall sell See, unfortunately, it's saying you sell yourselves, but it cuts off. So I'll scroll back up to the top of the next column where you can see the remainder of the verse. To make that easier to read, I'll put the two portions together. And once that's done, you can see that the Geneva Bible rendering of Deuteronomy 28:68 has sell yourselves more than 50 years before the King James Bible. That shows that the understanding of the verb hitmaker as reflexive did not begin after the time of the King James Bible. Rather, it predates the KJV. And now we can go to sources which are much older than the Geneva Bible. For example, we can go to the commentary of Rashi, which dates to the 11th century. And I've touched on Rashi in some of my previous videos. And you see his commentary here on the relevant verb, the verb hitmakhartem. And he says, Bela'az, or Beloez if you prefer, but literally in a foreign language, but he means Judeo-French. He uses this word to refer to the French of his time, and then he transliterates it into Hebrew characters, and it works out to E por vendres vos. Now, I'm not very proficient in French, but it's my understanding that would correspond to the modern French, et pour vendre vous, and you will sell yourselves. Or maybe et pour vendre vous. You'll have to forgive me again. I'm not really familiar with French. So that's what he's attempting to say in his, 1,000-year-old French dialect. It was the equivalent to "you will sell yourselves," and he makes that more clear. He goes on to say, "Lo yitaken lefarish hitpa'el belashon v'nimkartem," which means that it's not possible to interpret or explain hitpa'el along the lines of nimkartem, and nimkar is the passive. So if hitmaker can be either passive or reflexive, and it's not the passive, that means it's the reflexive. So it's not nimkar, which he explains al yadeh mukrim acherim, as if by the hand of other sellers. So he's saying it doesn't mean you're going to be sold by others, and the reason he gives is mifnei shene'amar acharau, that right after that it says there will be no buyer. So he's saying if nobody's buying you, then you're not being sold. Rather, he's saying that it implies that you're going to seek to sell yourselves. And a similar claim is made a century later by Ibn Ezra, as you see here, the interpretation of Ibn Ezra, who, by the way, lived in Spain. So, some people like to talk about Sephardic Jews, medieval Sephardic Jews. This would be an example of such. And in his commentary on hitpa'el, he says, "Eno kemo v'nimkartem." Again, same thing. It's not like the passive, which would mean it would have to be the reflexive. And then he adds, "Rak perusho," rather, its interpretation or its explanation is, "Atem tebakshu limkor atzimchem." You will seek to sell yourselves. So he's even more explicit about it being in the reflexive. Now, I understand that those who want to hold to the King James reading can say that they don't care what Rashi or Ibn Ezra said. So it'd be interesting to note where else the relevant verb appears. So just to give two quick examples, here I am in 1 Kings, the 21st chapter, and you go down to the 25th verse, and you find the verb hitmaker, right? And so do you know how the verb hitmaker is translated in the King James Bible, in this case, in 1 Kings 21:25? It's rendered reflexively as sell himself. And then we can turn to 2 Kings, the 17th chapter, 2 Kings 17:17. So here's verse 17. And so hitmaker was in the third person singular, perfect tense. And here you have vayitmakru, which is the third person plural imperfect tense. Again, 2 Kings 17:17. And do you know how this is translated in the King James Bible? Once again, it's interpreted reflexively as meaning sold themselves. They sold themselves. And so with that, before closing, let's give a quick recap of a few of the examples of how the verb hitmaker is rendered in the King James Bible. Of course, we have Deuteronomy 28:68, where the verb is rendered v'hitmekhartem in the second person plural perfect tense with a wa conversive prefix to it, and the KJV translates it, "and you will be sold." Then we looked at 1 Kings 21:25, where the verb is rendered hitmaker in the third person singular perfect tense, which is the standard or base form of the verb, and the KJV translates it, "sold himself." And finally, we looked at 2 Kings 17:17, where the verb is rendered vayitmakru, which is in the third person plural imperfect tense, and again with a wa conversive prefix to it, and the KJV translates it, "and sold themselves." Note that in Deuteronomy and 1 Kings, the verb is essentially identical, save for the fact that the former is second person plural, meaning you, plural, while the latter is third person singular, meaning he. As for the verses in Deuteronomy and 2 Kings, both have the wa conversive, which is essentially which can essentially convert the tense of the verb. Hence why the verb in Deuteronomy, though it's in the perfect tense, which is typically translated in the past tense, is here rendered in the future tense. And likewise, the verb in 2 Kings, though it's in the imperfect tense, which is typically translated in the future tense, is here rendered in the past tense. The point is the wa conversive, in a sense, changes the tense, but that's a minor point for another conversation. I just wanted to make sure it was clear. But putting that aside, the more relevant point is this. Note that the verb in 2 Kings is translated in the reflexive. And likewise, the verb in 1 Kings is also translated in the reflexive. However, the verse in Deuteronomy is translated in the passive. We see that the King James translators were aware that the hitpa'el stem can most literally convey the reflexive, and therefore I would say that so too for Deuteronomy, a more literal approach to that verse would treat it as reflexive and thus translate it, you will sell yourselves. Now, before I close, I just want to be careful to note that I am not claiming that the KJV is necessarily in error at Deuteronomy 28:68. As I noted earlier in this video, verbs in the hitpa'el stem can be read passively rather than reflexively, but I would also say that that's often somewhat of a less literal approach. However, it can be argued that the Septuagint translators understood the verb in Deuteronomy as passive as well. Now, to be clear, my intention here was not to cast aspersions on the KJV reading. Rather, my intention was only to explain why the alternative readings in these more recent translations are uncontroversial and why there's no need to try to explain them via appeals to conspiracy theories. As we saw, the tendency to read the verb reflexively long predates the King James Bible. I mean, you can see, as I showed, it comes up in commentaries that predate the King James Bible by, 500 years. But by half a millennium. And we also see that the King James translators themselves recognized that the verb in the hitpa'el could be understood that way. It could be understood reflexively, right? So the reflexive would simply be the more literal approach to the verb. This is going to be a brief addendum to my previous video on Deuteronomy 28:68. I want to briefly show how the verb hitma'kartem is translated in a couple of ancient Aramaic translations. So first I'm going to go through my copy of Mikrot Gedolot to go to Targum Onkelos. And of course, as you already know, we're in Deuteronomy, specifically the 28th chapter and the 68th verse, and this is Targum Onkelos. And here's the verb right here. Tizdabnun. That's how hitma'kartem is translated in Targum Onkelos. Tizdabnun, as you see on your screen right here. Aside from Targum Onkelos, I also want to show the reading in the Syrian Aramaic Peshitta. You see here, Ketab HaKadisha, the Holy Book. So this is my copy of the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible. I got this from a church, a Syrian Orthodox church in Teaneck, New Jersey, many years ago, like 16 years ago. And I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy, or as it's called in Syriac, Tenyan Namusa. And so you see it right here, literally the second law, Tenyan Namusa, or Deuteronomy. And of course, it's going to be the 28th chapter, as you well know, and the 68th verse. And so here's the verb right here, and I'll once again emblazon it on the screen, and here it is in the Serta script. I can also transcribe it in the Estrangela script. For those who don't know, there's more than one Syriac script, and now I'll transcribe these characters into the Hebrew script to show you that this is the exact same verb that we saw in Targum Onkelos, and that is the verb tizdabnun, which I'd like to quickly explain now. Earlier, we discussed Hebrew's hitpa'el verb stem. Post-biblical forms of Aramaic, like the forms of Aramaic found in Targum Onkelos and the Peshitta, have a corresponding verb stem, itpa'al. And as you can see on your screen, this Aramaic stem has an aleph, where the Hebrew equivalent has a he. However, quick technical note, in biblical Aramaic, the verb stem also starts with a he, like in Hebrew. It's only in these post-biblical forms of Aramaic that it's an aleph rather than a he. And just to be clear, I'm referring here to the base form, which corresponds to the third-person masculine singular perfect tense in either case, whether it's the hitpa'el or the itpa'al. In either stem, you have the verbal root, which I'll mark in red here, and that is preceded by the prefix, which serves as a mark indicating the verb stem. So this would that prefix would be he tau in the Hebrew verb stem and aleph tau in the verb stem that exists in post-biblical forms of Aramaic. However, in both verb stems, certain roots result in the verb taking on a slightly altered form, such as if the root starts with a shin, a sin, or a samech, or a tzadeh, or a zayin, for example. So, for an example, consider the Aramaic root samech mem resh, samar, which can give rise to verbs meaning to prepare, and it may be somewhat related to Hebrew's shamar root, which meant to guard. So here you see how we might initially expect the samar root to look in the hitpa'el stem. However, anytime a root starting with a samech appears in either of these stems, the samech and tau are transposed, which is to say they switch places. So instead of it samar, the verb is is tamar, which might be thought of as having a meaning roughly along the lines of prepare yourself or perhaps even guard yourself. In Targum Onkelos' translation of Genesis 24:6, this is the verb employed when Abraham says to beware. Now, for another example, which will be more relevant to the verb we just saw in Deuteronomy 28:68, consider the zayin he resh root, zahar, which can give rise to verbs meaning to warn. So with this root in the hitpa'el stem, it can mean to warn yourself or, again, to beware. We might expect the verb to take the structure you see on your screen. However, in post-biblical forms of Aramaic, if the root starts with zayin, then the hitpa'el stem, in the hitpa'el stem, the zayin and the tau are again transposed. However, in this case, still another change occurs, and that is when the tau is changed to a dalet. It's assimilated into a dalet. So the zahar root in the hitpa'el stem, we might expect this to take the form it zahar, but instead it takes the form is dahar. And this is the verb the Peshitta employs in its translation of the verse I just mentioned, Genesis 24:6, when Abraham says beware, he says is dahar. By the way, quick technical note about this phenomenon with roots that begin with zayin. There's an instance in Daniel 4:12, corresponding to Daniel 4:9 in rabbinic Bibles, where this change does not occur. The verb yitzil, which is employed to refer to each creature feeding itself, has a root beginning with zayin, yet there's no transposition of the sort that we mentioned, nor is there a change from tau to dalet. However, on the other hand, at Daniel 2:9, the Masoretic text's marginal note in what's called the krei has the verb hizdmintun, where the relevant change does occur with a root that starts with zayin. However, being that this is found in the Masoretic marginal note and not the base text, I honestly am uncertain whether this should be considered part of biblical Aramaic or should be seen as some sort of post-biblical Aramaic phenomenon, which the Masoretes thought was properly part of the text. Whatever the case, having discussed this phenomenon, we can now return to the verb we found at Deuteronomy 28:68 in both Targum Onkelos and the Peshitta, which is to say the ancient Jewish Aramaic and Syrian Aramaic translations, respectively. That verb, again, is tizdabnun. The root for that verb is zayin beit nun, zaban, which gives rise to verbs along the lines of to buy or to sell. The dalet after the zayin it undergoes that same phenomenon where the tau from the stem's prefix is transposed with that first letter of the root, with that zayin. So the zayin and the tau are transposed, and then the tau is assimilated into a dalet. As for the tau at the beginning of the verb, which is still there, and as well as the wa nun at the end of the verb, those are due to the verb being rendered in the second person plural imperfect tense. Tizdabnun. And now I'd like to look that verb up in the dictionary of Marcus Jastrov, or Jastrow, as some call him. So I'm going to go to the page for the, again, Zayin Beit Nun root, which, bear with me, I'll be turning to in a moment. And once we're there, here we go. And this is the entry right here. And I'm going to scroll down to the portion of the entry which pertains to the hitpa'el verb stem. And as we see, which is the case with many verbs in the hitpa'el verb stem, the verb can be read passively or reflexively. When it's read reflexively, it can mean to sell yourself. However, what I find particularly interesting is Yastrov's entry points to a passage in the Talmud, in tractate Kiddushin, where it's argued that the text is employing the specific verb in reference to someone setting themselves up to be sold as a Hebrew slave. And this is tractate Kiddushin 69a in the Babylonian Talmud, which is the reference pointed to by Yastrov's dictionary. It begins with a claim that it is possible for a mamzer to be purified. A mamzer is someone who was conceived in certain kinds of illicit unions and whose children would be excluded from the congregation for several generations in a row. The text proposes an apparent loophole where if a mamzer has a child with a female servant, a slave woman, their son would be a slave, but if that son is then set free, he would apparently be, quote-unquote, purified, implicitly meaning he would no longer be a mamzer. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with that sort of reasoning. I'm merely noting this because an example is then given of how this sort of reasoning is applied, and the portion describing that example winds up employing the same verb that we found in onkelos and the peshita at Deuteronomy 28. So the text goes on to say that an innkeeper or a landlord of some sort who was hosting Rabbi Simlai was a mamzer. And so Simlai tells the landlord or innkeeper, if I was before you, apparently meaning if I knew you earlier or if I knew about your situation earlier, I would have purified your son. And then, applying the loophole just mentioned, Simlai tells the man, go, steal, and sell yourself as a Hebrew slave. The relevant verb there for sell yourself is izdaben. That is the same verb which appeared in onkelos and the peshita, save for the fact that in this instance, the verb is in the imperative, while in those sources, in onkelos and the peshita, it was in the second person plural imperfect tense. The reason why this is relevant is because while the verb can be read passively or reflexively, here it seems to more closely align with the reflexive. Even if we try to read this text in the Talmud in the passive, the man was still encouraged to set himself up to be sold into slavery. So even in the passive, it still has a reflexive feel. And therefore, that provides good reason to think of the verb in Deuteronomy, in these Aramaic translations of Deuteronomy, as also reasonably or likely to be in the reflexive as well. You know what, I'll quickly sum up the salient points of what was covered, and then I'll close the video. So, much like the Hebrew verb hitmaker, the Aramaic verb izdaben, rendered tizdabnun in the translations we peeked at, that verb has the potential to be read reflexively or passively. And the introduction or the insertion of this Talmudic text for further insight seems to provide us with more reason to read the text reflexively. With that, I'll close here. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.